The world went dark the moment Rasha Mordak heard the first crack of timber above her head, and by the time the dust settled, she was alone in a pocket of stone no wider than a horse stall. She coughed, spat grit, and pressed her calloused palm against the rockfall that had swallowed the tunnel behind her. Solid. The air already tasted thin, metallic with fear and the tang of disturbed earth. Her lantern had survived, a small mercy, its flame dancing shadows across green skin slick with sweat, and the gray dust that coated everything in the White Peak silver mine. She was 200 feet down, maybe more, and the only thing between her and slow suffocation was the hope that someone on the surface still cared enough to dig. Rasha forced herself to breathe slowly, to think like the miner she was. Panic killed faster than bad air. She had her tools, her pick and hammer, and she knew stone the way most people knew their own family. The collapse had been sudden but not total. The main shaft was gone, choked with rubble, but the support beams on her side had held just enough to leave her this pocket. She tapped her hammer against the rock in the pattern every miner learned on their first day. 3 sharp strikes, pause, 2 strikes, pause, 3 again. The code for trapped, alive, listening. She did not know if anyone would hear. She did not know if anyone would try. On the surface, Ethan Orrick was already moving before the foreman finished shouting. The ground had shuddered, a low rumble that every man who worked the mines knew and feared, and then the hoist cables had gone slack. Someone screamed. Dust erupted from the main shaft like a dying breath. Ethan dropped the timber he had been shaping and ran, his long legs eating the distance to the pithead in seconds. He was tall, lean, and quiet, the kind of man people forgot was in the room until they needed something built or fixed. He had worked the White Peak mine for 3 years, cutting and placing every beam that kept the tunnels from collapsing, and he knew with sick certainty that his work had not been enough this time. "Who was down there?" he demanded, grabbing the foreman by the shoulder. The older man's face was pale, eyes wide with shock. "Rasha and the Connolly brothers, South Vein," the foreman stammered. "They were pulling ore from the new seam." Ethan's heart lurched. He knew Rasha had worked alongside her more times than he could count. She was the best ore picker in the crew, quick and sure-handed, with a laugh that echoed off stone and a way of looking at him that made his carefully guarded thoughts scatter like startled birds. He had never told her that. He had never told anyone much of anything, preferring the company of wood and iron to words. "We have to get them out," Ethan said. It was not a question. The foreman shook his head, already backing away. "That whole section is unstable. We go digging now, we will bring the rest of it down. We have to wait, assess the damage. They do not have time to wait." Ethan turned and scanned the crowd of miners gathering at the pithead. He saw fear, shock, and the beginnings of resignation. These were hard men who had seen cave-ins before, who knew the brutal arithmetic of rescue versus risk. The Connolly brothers appeared a moment later, stumbling out of a side tunnel, bruised and shaken but alive. They had been near the junction when it went, far enough back to escape. That left only one person unaccounted for. "Rasha is still down there," Ethan said to no one in particular, and then louder to everyone. "Rasha is trapped." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Rasha was well-liked, respected for her skill, but she was also an orc in a crew of humans, and Ethan saw the calculation happening behind their eyes. How much risk for one of her kind? How much was a green-skinned woman worth when the mine owner would not pay for a dangerous dig? Ethan did not wait for their decision. He grabbed a coil of rope, a spare lantern and a pry bar, and headed for the secondary shaft, the narrow ventilation tunnel that ran parallel to the main vein. It would be tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders, but it was the only way down that might still be open. "Orrick, you fool, stop!" the foreman shouted, but Ethan was already descending, his boots finding the iron rungs bolted into the shaft wall. The air grew colder as he climbed down, the sounds of the surface fading into the deep silence of the earth. His lantern swung from his belt, casting wild shadows. He counted the rungs, estimating depth, until he reached the level where the south vein branched off. The tunnel here was scorched with fresh dust, and a wall of broken rock blocked the passage ahead. Ethan set down his lantern and pressed his ear to the rubble. For a long moment he heard nothing but his own pulse, and then, faint as a ghost, 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 again. She was alive. He pulled the hammer from his belt and answered, 2 taps, pause, 1 tap, I hear you. He did not know if she would understand, but a moment later he heard her respond, the same pattern repeated. Relief flooded through him, sharp and dizzying. He touched the stone as if he could reach through it, as if will alone could bring her back to the light. "Rasha," he called, not expecting her to hear his voice through the rock, but needing to say her name anyway. "I am here. I am going to get you out." On the other side of the collapse, Rasha heard the answering taps and closed her eyes. Someone was there. Someone was trying. She tapped back, slower this time, a longer pattern. 3, pause, 1, pause, 2, pause, 4. The old miner's code for measurements, telling him the size of her pocket, the direction she thought was safest to dig. She did not know if he would understand, but she had to try. The air was getting thinner, each breath a little harder to draw. She heard a new sound then, metal on stone, the steady ring of a pick biting into rock. He was digging. Alone, by the sound of it, with no echo of other tools. Rasha felt something twist in her chest, an emotion she could not name. Whoever he was, he had come down into the dark for her, and he was not leaving. She picked up her own hammer and tapped again, guiding him, telling him where the rock was weakest, where the old timbers might still hold. Hours passed. Rasha marked time by the rhythm of his work, the steady percussion of metal on stone that never stopped, never slowed. She used her pick to clear rubble on her side, working by feel as much as sight, her lantern oil burning lower. Her muscles ached, her lungs burned, but she kept going because he was still there, still digging, and she would not give up if he would not. She tapped a question. Who? The digging stopped. A long pause. Then, painstakingly slow, he tapped back in code. Ethan, Ethan, the timberman. Rasha felt her throat tighten. She knew him, of course. Everyone knew Ethan, the quiet human who built the frames that kept them all alive, who never spoke more than necessary but whose work was flawless. She had noticed him, too, in the way she tried not to notice anyone, because noticing led to wanting and wanting led to heartbreak. He was human. She was Orc. The mine was one of the few places where that did not matter as much as it did in the towns, but it still mattered. It always mattered. She tapped back her own name. Rasha. Another pause. Then, Know something in those 2 words tapped out in the dark made her chest ache worse than the thin air. He knew. He had come for her knowing exactly who she was, and he was still here, still digging. She pressed her forehead against the cool stone and let herself feel it. The terrifying, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she was not as alone as she had always believed. On the surface, the mine owner arrived as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Silas Garrett was a soft man with hard eyes, the kind who counted profit in ounces and losses in coins. He took one look at the pithead, at the crew standing idle, and his face went red. "Why is no one working?" he demanded. "We have quotas to meet." The foreman stepped forward, wringing his cap in his hands. "There was a collapse, sir. South vein. We lost one, an Orc woman, Rasha Mordak. Ethan Orrick went down to dig her out, but it has been hours and one orc, Garrett interrupted. You stopped production for one orc. And you let Orrick risk his neck for her. He shook his head, disgusted. Pull him out, seal the tunnel. We will mark it as a loss and move on. Sir, she could still be alive. She is an orc, Garrett snapped. And even if she were not, I will not pay good men to die for a fool's errand. Pull Orrick out now, or I will dock every man here a week's wages for this delay. The foreman looked at the crew, saw the anger and shame on their faces, but also the fear. Jobs were scarce. Families depended on mine wages. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. But when they went to the ventilation shaft to call Ethan up, they found he had taken the rope down with him. There was no way to reach him, no way to make him leave short of going down themselves, and no one was willing to risk Garrett's wrath to do it. Below, Ethan did not know about the argument on the surface, and he would not have cared if he did. His world had narrowed to the wall of stone in front of him, the ache in his shoulders, the blood on his knuckles where the pick handle had rubbed the skin raw. He worked by lantern light, prying loose rocks, shoring up the small gaps he created with scraps of timber he had carried down. It was agonizingly slow. Every stone he moved threatened to shift the whole mass, to bring it all down on his head. He worked with the patience he had learned from years of carpentry, testing each piece, feeling for the give and take of weight and balance. Rasha guided him through the wall. Her taps told him where to dig, when to stop, when to brace. They developed a rhythm, a language beyond words, her knowledge of stone and his understanding of structure blending into something seamless. He learned the pattern of her hammer, could distinguish her strikes from the settling of rock. She learned the sound of his breathing on the other side, ragged and determined. On the second day, his lantern oil ran out. He worked in darkness, guided only by touch and sound. Rasha heard the change, the way his strikes became more hesitant, and she tapped frantically. Stop. Wait. She sacrificed some of her own dwindling oil, pouring it into a crack in the rubble and lighting it, a tiny flicker of flame that seeped through the stones. It was not much, barely enough to see by, but Ethan saw it and understood. He tapped his thanks and kept digging. Thirst came next, a clawing, desperate need. Ethan had brought a water skin, but it was long empty. Rasha's was the same. They tapped through their misery, sharing it the only way they could, the rhythm of their hammers slower now, weaker. Ethan's hands shook. His vision swam. He braced himself against the tunnel wall and forced himself to keep moving, one strike at a time, because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant Rasha would die alone in the dark. He did not let himself think about why that was unbearable. He only knew it was. On the third day, he broke through. His pick punched into empty air, and he heard Rasha gasp on the other side. He dropped the tool and clawed at the gap with his bare hands, widening it, ignoring the way sharp stone tore his palms. Light spilled through, the glow of Rasha's failing lantern, and then he saw her face for the first time in 3 days. She was filthy, coated in dust and sweat, her dark hair matted against her skull. Her green skin was pale with exhaustion, and her tusks were bared in something between a grin and a grimace. Her eyes, amber and bright, met his through the gap, and Ethan felt the world tilt. "Ethan," she said, her voice hoarse and cracked, and it was the first time he had heard her say his name. It sounded like a prayer. "Rasha," he answered and reached through the gap. She took his hand, her grip strong despite everything, and he held on like she was the only solid thing left in the world. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I came." She laughed, a broken, ragged sound. "You are insane. You should have left." "No," Ethan said simply and squeezed her hand. "I should not have." The gap was not wide enough yet. He pulled back reluctantly and picked up his pry bar. Rasha grabbed her pick and they worked together now, side by side though still separated, tearing down the wall between them. Rocks tumbled. Dust choked the air. Ethan's muscles screamed, but he did not stop, and neither did she. Finally, the gap was wide enough. Ethan braced the opening with a timber and reached through. "Come on," he said. "Let us get you out of here." Rasha squeezed through the opening, scraping her shoulders, tearing her shirt, not caring. She tumbled into Ethan's arms, and they both collapsed against the tunnel wall, gasping, shaking, alive. He held her without thinking, his arms around her shoulders, her face pressed against his chest. She smelled like sweat and stone and survival, and Ethan thought he had never felt anything so real. "Can you walk?" he asked after a moment. "I can crawl if I have to," Rasha said, and pushed herself upright. Her legs wobbled, but she stayed standing. Ethan stood with her, one hand steadying her elbow. They looked at each other in the dim light, and something passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. "We need to move," Ethan said, breaking the moment before it could crack him open. "This whole section is unstable." They made their way back through the tunnel, Ethan leading, Rasha following close behind. The climb up the ventilation shaft was brutal. Ethan went first, pulling himself up the iron rungs with arms that felt like wet rope. Rasha came after, slower, her strength nearly gone. Twice she slipped, and twice Ethan caught her, bracing her with his legs while she found her grip again. They emerged into daylight just as the sun was setting on the third day, and the crew, who had been watching the shaft in defiance of Garrett's orders, erupted into shouts. Hands reached down to pull them up, to steady them. Someone pressed a water skin into Rasha's hands, and she drank deep, choking, water spilling down her chin. Ethan took his turn, the cool liquid like a miracle on his torn throat. The foreman pushed through the crowd, his face a mix of relief and dread. "Orrick, you damn fool, you did it," he said, and then lower. "Garrett is going to have your hide." "Let him try," Ethan said, his voice raw but steady. He looked at Rasha, who was leaning against a support beam, still drinking, still breathing. "She is alive. That is all that matters." Silas Garrett appeared as if summoned by his name, his face twisted with fury. "Orrick, you defied a direct order. You risk this mine, risk these men for an orc. You are finished. Get off my sight before I have you arrested for sabotage." Ethan turned to face him, and the crew fell silent. He was a mess, blood and dust and exhaustion, but he stood straight and met Garrett's eyes without flinching. "I saved a life," he said. "If that makes me finished, so be it." "You saved an orc," Garrett spat. "She is not worth the timber you wasted, let alone 3 days of lost production." Something shifted in the crowd. Ethan saw it in the faces around him, the way jaws tightened and shoulders squared. These were men who had worked beside Rasha, who had trusted her to know the stone, who had seen Ethan's loyalty and recognized it for what it was. One of the Connolly brothers stepped forward, a broad man with a scarred face. "Rasha saved my life last winter when a beam gave way," he said. "She held the timber until I got clear, nearly broke her back doing it." Another voice, a younger miner. "She taught me how to read the seams. I would have died my first month without her." More voices joined, a chorus of debts and memories, and Garrett's face went from red to purple. "This is mutiny," he snarled. "I will fire every last one of you, then do it," the foreman said quietly, and Ethan looked at him in surprise. The older man shrugged. "I have been working mines for 30 years, and I have never seen loyalty like that. If you fire Orrick, you fire me too. And I expect you will be firing most of this crew." The men nodded, a wall of solidarity that even Garrett could not ignore. He looked around, saw the determination in their faces, and knew he was beaten. "Fine," he hissed. "Orrick, you are done here. Take your orc and get out. The rest of you back to work, or you will join him." Ethan did not argue. He held out his hand to Rasha, who took it and let him pull her upright. They walked away from the mine together, past the pithead, past the equipment sheds, until the sounds of the crew faded behind them. Neither spoke until they reached the edge of the camp, where the road split between the town and the open country beyond. "Where will you go?" Rasha asked, her voice still rough. Ethan looked at her, this woman he had torn through stone to reach, and realized he had no idea. He had worked the mine since he was 16, had saved almost nothing, had no family and no plans beyond the next timber frame. But looking at Rasha, at the way the setting sun caught the green of her skin and turned it to bronze, he thought maybe that was all right. "I do not know," he admitted. "Where will you go?" Rasha laughed, soft and bitter. "I do not know either. I have no home but the mines, and I do not think Garrett will let me back." They stood together in the fading light, two people with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memory of 3 days in the dark. Ethan thought about the way her hand had felt in his, the way her voice had guided him through the stone, the way she had not given up even when the air ran thin and hope seemed impossible. "We could figure it out together," he said, the words awkward and uncertain but true. Rasha looked at him and her amber eyes were wet. "You would do that, tie yourself to an orc, you know what people will say." "I know what I did," Ethan said. "I dug through stone to reach you. I am not walking away now." She smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her, bright and fierce. "You are a strange man, Ethan Orrick." He huffed a laugh despite himself. "Maybe, but I am your strange man if you will have me." Rasha did not answer with words. She stepped forward and kissed him, her tusks cool against his lips, her mouth tasting of dust and water and survival. Ethan kissed her back, his torn hands gentle on her face, and felt something in his chest unlock, some door he had kept closed his whole life swinging open. When they pulled apart, the sun had set and the stars were beginning to show. "We should find somewhere to sleep," Rasha said. "Somewhere that is not underground." Ethan nodded. "Agreed. Never underground again." They walked to the town together, hand in hand, and found a small boarding house that would take them despite Rasha's green skin and the scandal of their obvious affection. The landlady was old and practical, more interested in their coin than their story, and she gave them a room with 2 narrow beds and a wash basin. Ethan collapsed onto one bed fully clothed and was asleep before Rasha finished washing the worst of the dust from her face. She looked at him, this quiet man who had refused to abandon her, and felt her heart do something complicated and terrifying. She had spent her whole life armored against hurt, expecting rejection, accepting loneliness as the price of being born orc. And then Ethan had come with his pry bar and his stubbornness, and torn through every wall she had built. She climbed into the other bed and let herself sleep, really sleep, for the first time in days. They woke late the next morning, sore and stiff but alive. Ethan's hands were bandaged in strips torn from an old shirt, and Rasha's shoulders were purple with bruises. They ate a breakfast of hard bread and weak tea in the boarding house kitchen, and then sat together at the table, trying to decide what came next. "I have some money saved," Ethan said. "Not much, but enough to buy tools, maybe some supplies." "I have a little too," Rasha added. "I never spent much. No point when there was nothing to spend it on." Ethan traced a finger along the wood grain of the table, thinking, "I am good with timber, I can build. And you know stone, mining the earth. We could buy land," Rasha said slowly, the idea forming as she spoke. "Somewhere away from the mines, somewhere above ground." Ethan looked at her, and she saw the same hunger in his eyes that she felt, the longing for open sky and clean air. "A homestead," he said. "We could build a house, grow things, be our own." "People will talk," Rasha warned. "Worse than talk, maybe. Let them. Ethan said. "We survived a cave-in and 3 days in the dark. We can survive anything." Rasha reached across the table and took his bandaged hand in hers, careful of the wounds. "Then let us do it. Let us build something that is ours." They spent the next 2 weeks recovering and planning. Ethan's hands healed slowly, the cuts scabbing over and the blisters hardening into fresh calluses. Rasha's lungs cleared, the tightness easing until she could breathe deep without coughing. They walked through the town together, ignoring the stares and whispers, and visited the land office to look at parcels for sale. Most of the good land was gone, claimed by established families or held by speculators. What remained was rough country, the kind of places that required work and faith in equal measure. They found a plot 10 miles north of the town, 50 acres of rocky hillside with a creek running through the bottom and a stand of pine on the eastern edge. It was cheap because it was hard, and it was perfect because it was theirs. Ethan bought it with most of his savings, and Rasha added hers to buy tools and seed. They loaded everything they owned into a borrowed cart and set out on a bright morning in early summer, leaving the mine and the town behind. The land was everything the claim had promised and nothing more. The soil was thin and rocky, the hillside steep, and the only structure was a half-collapsed hunter's shack that leaked when it rained. Ethan looked at it and laughed, a sound Rasha was still getting used to hearing from him. "Well," he said, "at least it is above ground." They set to work the next day. Ethan felled trees from the pine stand, cutting timber for a new house. Rasha cleared the rocks from a flat section near the creek, piling them into a low wall that would become the foundation. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, learning each other's rhythms, moving together with the ease of long practice. In the evenings they sat by a small fire and talked, really talked, in a way they had never been able to before. Rasha told him about growing up in a border settlement, the only orc child in a school full of human kids who either ignored her or bullied her. She told him about finding work in the mines, where the dark made everyone equal and skill mattered more than skin color. She told him about the loneliness, the way she had convinced herself she did not need anyone, did not want anyone, because wanting only led to pain. Ethan told her about his own childhood, about losing his parents to fever when he was young, and being passed between uncles who saw him as free labor. He told her about learning carpentry from a man who hit as often as he taught, and about leaving as soon as he was old enough to work on his own. He told her about the mines, the silence, the satisfaction of building something that kept people safe. He told her about seeing her for the first time 3 years ago and thinking she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, but never saying it because he assumed she would laugh or worse. "I would not have laughed," Rasha said softly, her hand finding his in the firelight. "I know that now," Ethan said and kissed her. The house went up slowly, one beam at a time. Ethan cut and shaped each piece with care, and Rasha fitted the stones for the hearth and chimney. They worked through the heat of summer, through rainstorms that turned the hillside to mud, through days when their muscles ached and their tempers frayed. But they did not stop, and they did not give up, because this was theirs, this house and this land and this life they were building together. By autumn, the house had walls and a roof. It was small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was solid and tight and theirs. They moved in on a cool October evening, carrying their few belongings across the threshold. And that night, they made love for the first time in a real bed in a real house with the stars visible through the window. Rasha traced the scars on Ethan's hands, the marks from digging through stone, and felt tears prick her eyes. "You did this for me," she whispered. "You tore through a mountain for me." "I would do it again," Ethan said and meant it. winter came, and with it the hard work of survival. They had a small crop of potatoes and turnips from the garden Rasha had planted, and Ethan hunted deer and rabbits in the woods. They split firewood and mended tools and made plans for the spring. They were not wealthy, not even comfortable, but they were free and they were together. And that was enough. In the dark months, when snow piled high and the world outside was white and silent, they stayed close to the fire and talked about the future. Ethan wanted to plant an orchard, apple trees on the south slope where the sun was strongest. Rasha wanted to dig a root cellar, proper storage for the winter crops. They talked about building a barn, maybe getting a cow or some chickens, expanding the garden. And one night, with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling low, Rasha said, "I want a family." Ethan looked at her, surprised. They had not talked about this, had barely let themselves imagine a future that far ahead. "A family," he repeated. "Children," Rasha said, her voice steady but her eyes uncertain. "I know it will be hard, half-orc children in a human world, but I want it anyway. I want to build something that lasts beyond just us." Ethan reached for her, pulling her close. "I want that too," he said. "I want everything with you." Rasha smiled against his chest. "Then we will make it happen. Somehow." Spring came, and with it new life. The snow melted, the creek ran high, and the hillside turned green. Ethan planted his orchard, tiny saplings that would not bear fruit for years, but represented hope all the same. Rasha dug her root cellar, carving into the hillside with the skills she had learned in the mines. They expanded the garden, planting beans and squash and carrots. And in the heat of summer, Rasha realized she was pregnant. She told Ethan one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and he stared at her for a long moment before breaking into a grin so wide it looked like it hurt. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, and she laughed with him, both of them giddy with joy and terror. The pregnancy was hard. Rasha was sick in the mornings, tired in the afternoons, and her body ached in ways she had never experienced. But Ethan was there, steady and patient, bringing her water and rubbing her feet and taking over the heavier work without complaint. He built a cradle from pine, sanding it smooth and carving their initials into the headboard. The town midwife refused to come when she heard the mother was Orc, but they found an older woman from a nearby homestead who had delivered dozens of babies and did not care about the color of anyone's skin. Her name was Martha, and she arrived a month before the baby was due, settling into the guest corner of their single room like she had always belonged there. "You will be fine," Martha told Rasha when the labor pains started on a cold February night. "You are strong. I have seen you carry stones that would break a man's back." Rasha was not so sure. The pain was unlike anything she had imagined, waves of it that made her vision go white and her breath come in gasps. Ethan held her hand, his face pale with worry, whispering encouragement that she barely heard over the roar in her ears. It took hours, long, brutal hours, but finally the baby came, a squalling, red-faced girl with a shock of dark hair and the tiniest tusks Rasha had ever seen. Martha cleaned her and wrapped her in a blanket and placed her in Rasha's arms, and Rasha looked down at her daughter and felt her heart break open in the best possible way. "She is perfect," Ethan whispered, his voice choked with tears. "She is ours," Rasha said, and kissed the baby's forehead. They named her Fenna, after Ethan's mother, a name that meant peace. She was a good baby, quiet and watchful, with amber eyes that already seemed to see more than they should. Ethan held her like she was made of glass, terrified and awed in equal measure, and Rasha watched him sing lullabies in his rough voice and thought she had never loved him more. The first year with Fenna was exhausting and wonderful. She grew quickly. her green skin a shade lighter than Rasha's, her features a blend of both parents. She smiled early and laughed often, and she had a grip like iron that she used to pull Ethan's hair and Rasha's ears with equal enthusiasm. Neighbors came, eventually, curious about the half-orc baby and the odd couple raising her. Some were kind, bringing gifts of food or clothes. Others were cold, their disapproval obvious in every stiff word and forced smile. Ethan and Rasha accepted both with the same quiet dignity, neither seeking approval nor apologizing for their existence. When Fenna was 2, Rasha found herself pregnant again. This time was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and in the autumn she gave birth to another girl. They named her Jessa, and she had Ethan's blue eyes and Rasha's dark hair, and a laugh that could be heard across the hillside. The house grew crowded. Ethan added a second room, a nursery for the girls, and then a third when Rasha announced she was pregnant for a third time. This baby was another girl, born in the spring with a temper to match the season's storms. They named her Arya, and she had lungs that could wake the dead, and a stubborn streak that both parents recognized and secretly admired. Life settled into a rhythm. Ethan worked the land, planting and harvesting, tending the orchard that was finally beginning to bear fruit. Rasha managed the household, teaching the girls to read and count, to tend the garden and care for the animals they had slowly acquired. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, their small farm producing enough to feed them and sell a little at market. The girls grew, wild and free on the hillside, climbing trees and wading in the creek and learning the names of every plant and bird. Fenna was serious and thoughtful, always watching, always asking questions. Jessa was bright and laughing, making friends with every animal she met. Arya was fierce and fearless, charging into every new experience with a grin. People in the town still whispered, still stared, but the girls learned to ignore it. They had each other, and they had parents who loved them fiercely, and that was armor enough against the world's cruelty. One evening, when Fenna was 10 and the younger girls were playing by the creek, Ethan and Rasha sat together on the porch and looked out over the land they had built. The house was solid and weathered now, the orchard full and green, the garden lush with summer growth. "You ever regret it?" Rasha asked, the question she had never quite dared to voice. Ethan looked at her, confused. "Regret what? This, me, the girls, leaving the mines, giving up your old life." Ethan took her hand, the same hand he had held through a wall of stone all those years ago. "I gave up nothing," he said. "I gained everything. I would dig through 1,000 mountains for you, Rasha. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Rasha leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, and felt the truth of his words settle into her bones. They had built this life from nothing, from disaster and desperation and a stubborn refusal to give up on each other. It had not been easy. It had been hard and painful and sometimes terrifying. But it had been worth it, every moment, every struggle. "I love you," she said, simple and true. "I love you too," Ethan answered and kissed the top of her head. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their daughters. When Fenna turned 15, a young man from the town began visiting, drawn by her quiet intelligence and her mother's reputation as the woman who had survived a mine collapse. Ethan watched him with a father's suspicion, but Rasha saw the way the boy looked at Fenna, with respect and wonder, and she approved. Jessa, at 13, announced she wanted to be a healer like Martha, who still visited occasionally and had become a beloved fixture in their lives. Rasha arranged for her to apprentice, and Jessa threw herself into learning with the same joy she brought to everything. Arya, at 11, declared she was going to be a fighter and began training with a wooden sword Ethan made for her. She was fierce and determined, and Ethan taught her what he knew of defense, though he hoped she would never need it. One autumn afternoon, when the leaves were turning gold and the air smelled of smoke and apples, a group of men from the mine came up the road. Ethan saw them from the orchard and felt his stomach tighten. He had not been back to White Peak in over a decade, had not wanted to, and he did not know what they wanted now. The foreman, older and grayer but still recognizable, led the group. He stopped at the edge of the property and waited for Ethan to approach. Rasha came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, the girls clustering behind her. "Orrick," the foreman said, nodding. "Rasha, it has been a long time." "It has," Ethan agreed, cautious. "What brings you here?" The foreman looked uncomfortable. "Garrett is dead, died last winter. The mine passed to his son, and the boy is not like his father. He has been asking about you, about what happened. He wants to make it right." Ethan felt Rasha's hand slip into his, her grip tight. "Make what right?" "The firing. The way you were treated. He wants to offer you compensation and an apology." The foreman pulled a folded paper from his coat. "He sent this. A deed to a portion of the mine's profits, backdated to when you left. It is not much, but it is something." Ethan took the paper, unfolded it, and read. The sum was substantial. Years of wages he had never received. It would mean security, money for the girls' futures, repairs to the farm. It would mean acknowledgement after all these years that what he had done mattered. He looked at Rasha and she looked back, her amber eyes steady. "It is your choice," she said. Ethan folded the paper and handed it back to the foreman. "Tell Garrett's son thank you, but no." The foreman blinked, surprised. "No, Orrick, this is a fortune. I do not want his money," Ethan said. "I do not want anything from that mine. What I did for Rasha, not for wages or compensation or apologies. We have everything we need here." The foreman looked at the house, at the orchard, at the family standing together on the porch, and slowly he nodded. "I understand," he said. "I will tell him." He hesitated, then added, "For what it is worth, you did the right thing. We all knew it then, and we know it now." "Thank you," Ethan said, and meant it. The men left, walking back down the road toward the town, and Ethan turned to find his daughter staring at him with wide eyes. "You turned down a fortune?" Fenna asked, disbelieving. "We do not need it," Ethan said. "We have this." He gestured to the farm, the house, the land. "We have each other. That is worth more than all the silver in White Peak." Arya grinned. "You are strange, father." Ethan laughed and pulled her into a hug. "Maybe, but I am your strange father, and that is all that matters. That winter was mild, the snow light and the cold bearable." Ethan and Rasha celebrated their 15th year together with a quiet dinner, the girls already asleep in the loft. They sat by the fire, hands clasped, and talked about the past and the future in equal measure. "You ever think about the mine?" Rasha asked. "About those 3 days?" "Sometimes," Ethan admitted, "but not with fear, with gratitude. Gratitude, it brought us together. If the collapse had not happened, I would have kept my distance, kept my feelings locked away. I would have lost you before I ever had you." Rasha leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think about it too, about being trapped in the dark and hearing you dig, about knowing someone cared enough to try." "I will always care enough to try," Ethan said. "For you, for the girls, for this life we built. I will dig through stone every day if that is what it takes." "I know," Rasha said and kissed him. "That is why I love you." They sat together in the firelight, two people who had found each other in the dark and built a life in the light, and they were content. The girls grew into women, each finding their own path. Fenna married her young man and moved to a neighboring homestead, close enough to visit often. Jessa became a skilled healer, traveling between the farms and settlements, bringing comfort and care wherever she went. Arya, true to her word, became a guard, protecting the roads and keeping travelers safe. Ethan and Rasha grew older, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing but their love as strong as ever. They tended the orchard and the garden, watched grandchildren come and grow, and sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the land they had claimed from stone and sweat and stubborn hope. One spring evening, when the apple trees were in bloom and the air was sweet with their scent, Rasha looked at Ethan and said, "We did it. We built something that lasts." Ethan smiled, his face lined and weathered but his eyes still bright. "We did," he agreed, "and it was worth every moment." They sat together as the light faded, two people who had torn through stone to reach each other, who had built a life from nothing, who had loved fiercely and without regret. The world had tried to tell them they were impossible, that an orc and a human could not build a life together, but they had proven it wrong. They had survived the collapse. They had survived the prejudice and the poverty and the doubt. They had survived because they refused to give up, because they chose each other every day, through every hardship and every joy. And in the end, sitting together in the twilight with the smell of apple blossoms and the sound of their grandchildren laughing in the distance, they knew they had won. Not against the world, not against the people who had doubted them, but for themselves, for each other, for the life they had built together. Ethan took Rasha's hand, the same hand he had held through a wall of stone all those years ago, and felt the same certainty he had felt then. She was his, and he was hers, and nothing, not stone or prejudice or time itself, could change that. "I would do it all again," he said, his voice soft. "So would I," Rasha answered, and leaned her head on his shoulder as the stars began to appear overhead. They sat together in the growing dark, content and complete, two souls who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would outlast them both. The house stood solid behind them, the orchard bloomed around them, and the land they had claimed stretched out in every direction, a testament to what could be built when two people refused to let the world dictate their worth. In the distance, a nightingale sang, its voice clear and sweet in the spring air. Ethan and Rasha listened together, hand in hand, and smiled. They had made it. Through stone and darkness, through doubt and pain, through every obstacle the world had thrown at them, they had made it to this moment, this peace, this love. And it was enough. It was everything.